Let's begin. Please, if you haven't already, grab a snack in the back. We are semi-formal here, but we're not quite like a Platonic symposium where the wine flows freely, I hate to say. So. Dr. McClelland is a classicist, and he had to add "and the sex" too. So. Richard McClelland is a professor of philosophy at Gonzaga University here in Spokane, where he has been since 1999, and from which he will shortly, at the very end of this semester, retire. His main research interests lie at the intersection of contemporary neuroscience, anthropology, ethology, and empirical psychology with the philosophy of mind and moral psychology. He also has interests in philosophy and film, and the emerging field of neurocinematics, which he gave a talk on at the Faith, Film, and Philosophy conference just earlier this semester. Dr. McClelland is a native Northwesterner, having grown up in the shadow of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in the 50s and 60s, and studied at Reed College and Washington State University, receiving his BA from Reed in 1970. He studied theology and ancient philosophy at the graduate level at Princeton, Oxford, and Cambridge. He couldn't get enough, so. Receiving BA and MA degrees from Oxford and a PhD from Cambridge. Since that time, he has taught at Notre Dame, Seattle Pacific, and Seattle University before joining the Gonzaga philosophy faculty. Most of you know about the Socratic Club. The Socratic Club is an organization modeled on C.S. Lewis's Oxford Socratic Club. The Socratic Club here at Gonzaga is now in its 9th year. By my count, Dr. McClelland has been primary speaker, panelist, or designated respondent at meetings of the Socratic now 13 times, and will this afternoon participate in a formal way in the Socratic for his 14th time. I'm very confident that no other single person has contributed as much to the Socratic, both by participation and by, I might say personally, encouragement and support. So I find it particularly fitting that Richard is offering his last public lecture as a member of the Gonzaga faculty here at the Socratic Club. And that's why we're here this afternoon. It's nice to have him so involved for a number of reasons. One I particularly appreciate is the connection that his participation creates to Oxford and the founding of the original Socratic Club. Kind of nice to have an Oxonian here participating. Finally, Richard in certain ways exemplifies the spirit of both the original Oxford Socratic and the Gonzaga Socratic clubs. To quote our motto, our common motto, to follow the argument wherever it leads. McClelland was deeply influenced by the writings of C.S. Lewis as a young adult, and read and reread Lewis to the point where he mastered the texts and ideas of Lewis, which in turn inspired interest in Christian theology and philosophy. In recent years, the practice of following the argument has led him to a profound skepticism about key Christian claims, motivated in part by the problem of evil and in part by philosophical concerns about the epistemic distance between a radically transcendent God and fallible and limited human beings. It is to the second of these topics that Richard turns this afternoon, so if you would, please welcome Dr. Richard McClelland speaking about the hiddenness of God.
Thank you very much, and thank you, David, for those kind remarks. The Socratic Club in Oxford started in 1942 in the midst of the Second World War and wound up its affairs in 1972. One of the few regrets I have about my time in Oxford is that I arrived a year after it finished and thus had no contact with that organization. I do think it's important to keep in mind that the Socratic Club in Oxford was not founded by C.S. Lewis, it was founded by students. It was a student organization and a student club. They had to have a faculty representative as a kind of sponsor, and Lewis agreed to do that. Later, Basil Mitchell took over after Lewis left Oxford for Cambridge. One of the most notable meetings of the Oxford Socratic Club took place on the 2nd of February, 1948. And the occasion was a debate between Elizabeth Anscombe, who was then a young research fellow at Somerville College, Oxford, 28 years of age, and Lewis himself, over an argument which Lewis had propounded in an earlier edition of his book, Miracles. The argument was to the effect that naturalism is a self-refuting position. I would love to have been a fly on the wall. Both people were Christians, Lewis an Anglican of a very traditional mold, Anscombe a Roman Catholic by conversion during her undergraduate years. I never knew Lewis, I never knew the Socratic, but I did know Elizabeth Anscombe. She was for a period of time my supervisor in Cambridge, and a more formidable philosophical mind I have never encountered anywhere at any time. Indeed, sitting in the room with Professor Anscombe, her friends called her Gert, but the rest of us mere mortals, it was always Professor Anscombe, was a very formidable undertaking. My subject today springs from a fairly traditional view about divine attributes. Many of you will know this view as what is often described as perfect being theology. It is a tradition of great antiquity, and especially in the Christian tradition, though not only so, and one which has received a great deal of attention in recent years among philosophers of religion, both those who are practicing believers themselves and those who are not. The fundamental informing idea here is that God must be conceived to be as perfect a being as possible, and thus intuitions that we have about perfection should be brought to bear in understanding divine attributes. It is out of this that we get a certain view about the nature of divine knowledge, the notion of omniscience, a certain view about the nature of divine power, omnipotence, and a certain view of the nature of divine goodness, omnibenevolence. It is with omniscience that I am concerned mainly today, which, though it's, I think, very closely related to the other two leading attributes, since omniscience, I take it, springs from the free exercise and possession of every causal power that it is appropriate for a divine being to have, among these powers being cognitive powers. I shall suppose that omniscience can be characterized as the possession and complete transparency of every possible product, of every possible cognitive system whatsoever, including rational forms of cognition and non-rational modes of cognition, of which I think there are an abundance even among us. Now, to this view, has to be added, I think, also some sense of what it means to add omni to the term for science or understanding, and get omniscience out of it. I shall suppose that this has a relationship with infinitude. Moreover, I shall presuppose in my argument the standard way of understanding infinitude, which is a one-to-one relationship between the objects in a set or collection and the natural numbers. That is, if a set is countable, so that you can arrange them with a one-to-one relationship to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, then it is an infinite set, or as we often say, a countable set. For the natural numbers are infinite in their scope. In the case of divine omniscience, however, I think we need to go one step further. We happen to know, and indeed we happen to have some very dandy proofs in logical theory for the claim that numbers, other than the whole numbers, are much larger than infinite. For we can show that between any two natural numbers whatsoever, there are infinitely more. And thus we have to deal with sets which are uncountably many. And it is in this sense that I will understand divine omniscience as the simultaneous possession at any given time of an uncountable set of true propositions. That is, I take it that God being omniscient requires that God knows every truth that there is to be known, plus all of their logical relations with one another, all of their implications, and so on. Second thing I want to say a little bit about, just as a preliminary to my argument, has to do with affiliation. And David, I regret to say I'm about to diverge from the outline that I gave you earlier today. Affiliation is a particularly important phenomenon among human beings. This has to do with the way in which we develop close emotional bonds to our conspecifics, to other members of our species. Here we can think about a vast variety of social relationships which human beings value very highly. Our friendships, our mentoring relationships, our love relationships, relationships with spouses and other partners, and so on, relationships between parents and children, and the like. The range of affiliation which is available to human beings is really quite immense. Moreover, we know something about the biological basis of affiliation. We know something about the brain circuits that are typically engaged when we are involved in affiliative behavior. We know something about the social conditions that promote affiliation and those which militate against it. Most of us have experience with what the great John Bowlby used to call the making and breaking of affiliative bonds. Moreover, I think we all know, sometimes to our cost, just how valuable these can be. I told both of my classes today that there were three things they needed to know whenever they show up for the first day at a new job. One is, where is the nearest restroom? The second is, where is the nearest coffee bar? These things, of course, mutually implicate one another. And the third thing, vastly more important than the coffee bar or the restroom, is who is a good coalitional partner? With whom shall I build alliances? Such is true, I take it, in all human institutions. Survival in institutional life, which is the way most of us have spent our lives and will go on doing so, depends vitally on being a part of well-functioning coalitions or alliances. Aristotle once pointed out that such alliances have as one of their primary functions defending us against slander. I would go further. One of the primary purposes of good, well-functioning coalitions is to defend its members against all manner of attack. And there is, I think, no surviving in professional life without this. There's much more to be said here, of course, and we could explore the issue of affiliation, its biological roots, purposes, and functions for quite a long time. But I shall suppose, for the purposes of my argument, that friendship or affiliation is a primary value also in the religious life. That one way to put some of the central claims of Christian theism, as likewise Jewish or Islamic theism, is in terms of friendship with God. Here I'd like to exploit a little bit further some ideas of Aristotle. He points out that the most durable forms of affiliation are regularly based upon common sets of values. That these make the best friendships, for example. Indeed, he goes so far as to argue that without this, you cannot have the most effective form of friendship. And it seems to me, once again, that he is exactly right about this. A further feature of affiliative systems or combinations, alliances and coalitions, friendships, mentoring relationships, and so on, is that they often make possible causal powers which are not available to the individual members outside or apart from the activities of the group, of the coalition. Coalitions can do things which individuals cannot do. Not one man built Hoover Dam, after all. It took a whole crowd of people cooperating with one another for long periods of time. Indeed, large-scale and long-term human projects regularly depend upon this fact, that there are emergent causal powers that belong to groups of human beings that no individual has. Indeed, I think it is not difficult to see that the main reason why the human species has risen to the top of the food chain on this planet is precisely because of two particular powers that we have. One is the use of tools, and the other is the formation of cooperative coalitions. The combination of tool use and coalitions has enabled us to do all manner of things which none of us could accomplish individually. From rudimentary forms of hunting and gathering, foraging and agriculture, to the kinds of civilization which we enjoy today. Now, one of my claims in my argument here will be that in order for such affiliations to emerge, and in order for them to bring about the emergent causal powers which they regularly make available to their members, there must be a certain cognitive parity among the members, and that where this is lacking, such affiliation is unlikely and may even be impossible. My thesis is that according to perfect being theology, there is just such a lack of cognitive parity between the divine and ourselves. This is what I call epistemic distance. I wish I had a handy definition for epistemic distance. To my shock and horror, a rapid survey of recent philosophical literature suggests that nobody has a sharp definition of epistemic distance. So I want to approach the idea by way of some analogies and some metaphors. The first one is concerning parents and children. And here I'll beg leave to tell a couple of stories. So it's time for stories, children. When I was a child, about 10 years of age, I discovered in my parents' bedroom, in the bottom drawer of their desk, where they stashed their check stubs. Now, this will be a practice foreign to many people in the room, I realize, since nobody uses check stubs anymore. Well, you used to get checks in a book, and you wrote out the check, and then you tore it out of the book, and it left a stub on one side, where you entered the information. What was the check for, when was it dated, and it had the number, and all that sort of thing. And then you would keep these, because that was the record, right? And of course, later on, you got all the canceled checks back, and they were bundled up together. I was fascinated by finding these things in my parents' bedroom desk drawer, because I realized that I was looking at something that was a deep secret. Indeed, one of the two great deep secrets of adult life: money and its use. The other one, of course, is sex. I'll get to that in a minute. However, I could look at the stubs all day long, and I had no idea at all what they represented. I knew it had to do with money, but I did not and was not able to even conceive the projects that were represented there. My parents at the time, for example, were buying the house in which we lived. And like all homeowners, they had a mortgage, and it had to be paid every month. And there was a check stub that went for the mortgage. I did not know what a mortgage was. Indeed, I did not know what a loan was. I hate to tell you, but I have since found out. Now, the point I want to make here is that there was a project underway with my parents, which I had no conception of. I had stumbled across evidence of it, no doubt, but I didn't have the faintest idea what the project was, or what their intentions were, or what their fundamental values were with regard to this project, and that were embodied in that project. Not long after, about 2 years later, my friend Steve Hinkle, who lived directly across the street from me, came to me one day. We used to play together pretty regularly, and he said, "You want to see something?" And he said it with this salacious tone in his voice. I thought, oh, good, this is going to be good, whatever it is. He took me into his parents' bedroom and pulled out the bottom drawer of their dresser, underneath which was a stash of photographs. Photographs taken of his adults with a group of other adults engaged in various sexual activities. Now, I'm pretty sure that Mr. and Mrs. Hinkle had no idea that their children had penetrated this family secret. So we stood around looking at the photographs. We were prepubescent children, and quite frankly, what we mostly said was, What are they doing? What is this? It seemed bizarre and strange in the extreme. And indeed, it wasn't until many years later, after the dawning of adult forms of sexuality, that we had the least idea what was going on. There was a project there. This was, in fact, a sex ring of adults. You have to understand, post-war Richmond was a pretty bizarre place to live. People got bored easily. There wasn't very much to do. So it's perhaps not too surprising. High levels of alcoholism and the like of that. But my point, once again, is that as children, we were at a considerable epistemic distance from the adults, not unsurprisingly. Indeed, it's anything else that would be surprising. And as a consequence, we really had no idea what the project was, or what the fundamental values were, or what the basic intentions were. And yet here was something which these adults clearly cared about a great deal, and went to great lengths, among other things, to conceal from their children. I do have to say, it made for a rather odd relationship with Mrs. Hinkle in the succeeding years. Now, it seems to me that in both of these cases, affiliation, especially the kind of affiliation that Aristotle calls the perfect kind of affiliation, is not possible. My parents were not my friend, and I was not their friend. I was their child. We children, looking at the photographs of the sexual activity of our neighbors, were not their friends, nor they our friends. Indeed, on the point at stake, at issue, these adult projects, which were mysterious to us, unknown to us, and unintelligible to us, but perfectly transparent to any adult, it was not possible for us to form affiliation. That's my first analogy. My second one has to do with teaching the alphabet to the ants. And here I have a great debt to discharge to Carl Sagan, who is one of my heroes. One thing that I think is most regrettable is that he died at such an early age, only 62, to cancer. Carl Sagan wrote the book Contact. Some of you may know the film that was eventually made out of that. The novel is a great deal better than the film. That's, of course, a characteristic problem. You can't really squeeze a novel into a 2-hour film. You're going to distort everything and leave an awful lot out. Of particular moment, I think, is that the journey which is taken at the vital stage of the novel and the movie, in the novel, engages 5 people, not just one. And they are all scientists, 1 astronomer, 3 physicists, 1 biochemist, 2 physicists, 1 biochemist, and an archaeologist. And what happens here, of course, is that they are encountering an alien species, what the science fiction writers used to call a HILF, a higher intelligence life form. And they're encountering it chiefly in terms of its technology, which involves a transstellar transportation system, which they actually enter through a particular device and travel in to a distant stellar system. There's a long conversation in the novel, entirely missing from the film, because in the film only one person, Eleanor Arroway, makes the journey. But in the book, 5 of them do, and they're talking to each other all the time about what's happening to them. And the 2 physicists say at one point, "We think we can prove that what is happening right now is impossible." And then one of them says, and this is a young African physicist who's won the Nobel Prize recently for a major advance in physical theory, he says, "Surely our physics can't be that wrong." Well, what's happening, of course, is that they're in the position of a child, looking at an adult project which they do not understand, the purposes, intentions, and underlying values of which are indeed alien to them, and in which they never understand, because it is beyond them. Earlier in the novel, Eleanor Arroway has a person speculate about what it might be like to try to teach the alphabet to ants for a human being. What would it be like for a human, member of one species, to transcend the cognitive barriers and actually teach something by communication with a much lower species, an ant. The suggestion at that point in the book is that it couldn't do it. It's very interesting, I think, also in this novel, that the alien species, indeed it's a whole collection of such species, that the humans are encountering are using technology which they did not invent, the transportation system. They're asked at one point, how did they build it? And they said, we didn't build it. Somebody else built it. Well, who built it? And the answer is, we don't know. They have left. And we don't know where they went, or why, or whether they are ever coming back. And so suddenly a whole vista opens up. The humans are in the position of the ants. The aliens they've encountered are in the position of a human trying to teach the alphabet to the ants. But there are other species that they have already encountered the products of, and whose purposes, intentions, and fundamental values they don't understand either. All they did with the transportation system was to get it up and running. They didn't build it, they just maintained it. They're in the position of being the janitors, as it were. Now, you can see my problem looming, perhaps. I think I have one other analogy I want to entertain. Yeah. This will bring me back to Professor Anscombe. I once went to Professor Anscombe with a problem. It had to do with the text of Plato that I was reading, and I just didn't get it. I just had no idea what he was talking about. It was a passage in the Phaedo, and I happened to be scheduled for a supervision with Professor Anscombe, and so I went to see her to talk about it. And we had a very intense conversation that lasted for 4.5 hours about this passage. I have to tell you, Anscombe had more ability to concentrate on an intellectual problem than anybody else I've ever met. We were both exhausted by the end of it. Frequently, in the course of the conversation, I had to say to her, I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you just said. She would try to explain, sometimes succeeding, very often not. I was in the position of an amateur listening to an expert. I was in a position of cognitive asymmetry. She was vastly more experienced and able as a philosopher than I was. And she was thinking thoughts which I could not catch. They were so complex and dense. It was a little bit what it must be like to listen to somebody speak a language one has never heard before. Martian, for example. Now, I learned a lot from Professor Anscombe, but we were not friends, nor would we ever be. And now, perhaps you see my problem in full. For in the case of a divine being, an omniscient being, the cognitive asymmetry is not just very great, such as between the group of alien species that Eleanor Arroway and her friends meet in contact, or such as you or I might exercise if we were to work with our fellow primates, or as we commonly experience as parents of children, especially very young children, who after all belong to a different species. But rather we have to deal with a vast, not even infinite, cognitive asymmetry, but beyond that, a trans-infinite cognitive asymmetry. That is to say, with God, as conceived in this tradition, we have to do with a being or entity not merely vastly beyond our ability to conceive or understand, not even one infinitely far removed in those terms, but uncountably far removed. And thus it seems to me that the fundamental attitude that we are likely to have, the only one I think we can intelligibly take, is to say that God is unable to communicate to us and unintelligible to us. And in particular, that if God exists and has functioned more than infinitely far removed from our capacity to understand. Now, it's a bold person who would ever claim to have anything in common with Thomas Aquinas, but towards the end of his life, it is commonly said that Aquinas had an illuminating experience at Mass one day, after which he was reported to say that it seemed to him then that all the work he had done in theology and philosophy now appeared to him as mere straw. There has been much speculation as to what it was that happened to him. I do not know, of course, what happened to him. But I'm beginning to suspect that it may have something to do with the same insight I'm hoping to suggest to you today. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
It is the practice and tradition of the Socratic Club to have a formal respondent to presentations. And I'm very pleased that even though I'm the director of the Socratic Club, Richard asked me to respond to him. And so I have a couple of remarks to make. And then Richard can talk again, and then we'll have questions. How about that? I really appreciate that Dr. McClelland has brought Aristotle into the conversation, because the second article I ever published, incompetently some years ago, I might add, was an article titled, "Can Human Beings Be Friends of God?" So I was very much interested in this problem a long time ago. It's true that God is far beyond human reality. As Thomas notes, theology or sacred doctrine, quote, treats chiefly of those things which by their sublimity transcend human reason, while other sciences consider only those things that are within reason's grasp. At the same time, to quote Thomas once again from the same passage of the Summa Theologica, quote, the slenderest knowledge that may be obtained of the highest things is more desirable than the most certain knowledge obtained of lesser things. I want to try to address three grounds that support, in an admittedly slender way, to use Thomas's word there, our knowledge of a radically transcendent God, namely effects, analogy, and revelation, particularly the revelation of God in the Incarnation in Christian thought. First, effects. In Contact, and I have to say I want to read the novel, but I haven't yet, I've seen the film. In Contact, the device for which the aliens send the blueprints is so far ahead of human technology that it might as well be a magical black box, as Dr. McClelland's already explained. Essentially, it is a magical black box. So it is an example of transcendence, perhaps even radical transcendence. The humans who read the plans do not understand how the device works. Indeed, their failure to understand the technology underlying the device leads them initially to make modifications to the device with disastrous results. If you know the film, they try to fix it to protect the human occupant, and they end up killing the human occupant and destroying the machine, because you can't make the changes that were made. At the same time, the technology of the device is not so utterly transcendent to them that they are unable to appreciate several key points, to wit. First, the agents responsible for the plans for the device are real. Perhaps we don't know who they are, or where they are, even where they are, or even what relationship they have to the beings that transported the plans to us, but those beings are in some sense real. The agents, secondly, responsible for the plans for the device possess intelligence far beyond human intelligence. So far, I would agree with Dr. McClelland. But point three, the understanding and knowledge revealed by the plans is in some way continuous with existing human knowledge, such that human engineers can decipher the plans and build the device. In the same way, theists have traditionally argued that while divine intelligence is far superior to human intelligence, that divine intelligence is revealed to some degree by the effects of its creative activity, namely the cosmos itself. Whereas Carl Sagan famously said of the cosmos that it is, quote, all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be, theists of all stripes argue that it points beyond itself to something else. As St. Paul says, in the Epistle to the Romans, what may be known about God is plain to sinful human beings because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. The effects of God, the traces of his nature left in the world around us, are not restricted to the order and majesty of the physical universe. They also extend to the objective moral order that provides a reference for human choices and actions. This was a key argument of C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, if you're familiar with that. Humans have tried a range of ways to think about the divine traces in the perceivable world and explain them in terms of ranging from animistic spirits to anthropomorphic superhero gods to an ineffable being beyond being. But the cosmos itself is at least a clue to something beyond itself. So, effects. Second point, analogy. This leads us to a second point. While God is radically transcendent, that transcendence is not entirely alien to our experience of ourselves and the world, just as the aliens in contact are not completely alien to the humans to whom they reveal themselves. If God is as he is described in the theistic religions, which Dr. McClelland started with, that concept of the perfect being of perfect being theology, if God is conceived in this way, he is a real being, he is a person, he is intelligent, he wills and chooses. While these features of God cannot mean precisely what they mean for us in an ordinary human context, we can use them meaningfully and reasonably as analogies, as metaphors, as images seen through a glass darkly, to describe the reality of God. No such analytical reasoning will exhaust or fully reveal the divine nature, but it can point us to the reality beyond the limits of our understanding. Finally, revelation and incarnation. Theists assert that we are not entirely bereft in trying to understand God from our lowly position because God has chosen to reveal himself to us. Christians particularly identify this revelation as centered on the divine person of Jesus. The writer of the Epistle to the Hebrews notes that there is a progression to God's revelation, from prophets who speak forth the word of God to the direct revelation of God himself in the incarnated Son. There's much I could say here, but a respondent isn't supposed to talk all that long. So I'll just note one key point. Richard noted Aristotle's principle that radical disparity in rank relation makes a genuine relationship of friendship or mutual self-disclosure impossible. The central claim of the Incarnation, however, is that God becomes Emmanuel, God with us, and thereby overcomes the gulf of transcendence separating the human from the perfectly divine. To use Aristotle's language, humans cannot be friends with God, but through God's becoming human in the Incarnation, Christ becomes the mediator that makes friendship with the divine possible. Thank you.
David, I think, has picked three important elements which are both deeply embedded in the theistic tradition and strategically correct. If one is going to suggest a way of overcoming what I'm calling the problem of epistemic asymmetry and distance, then this would be the way to do it. To know a cause through its effects is something with which we are very familiar. Indeed, it's a foundational strategy in practical reasoning as well as theoretical reasoning among members of our species. It is one reason why we sometimes say things like actions speak louder than words, or as Aristotle liked to put it, choices reveal character more than actions do, and so on. Likewise, I think David is right to stress the venerable tradition of analogical thinking. And of course, the doctrine of the Incarnation looms large here. Now, however, I'm not persuaded. Well, that would be no surprise. Though I want to assure you, I've tried to give it a good run. I was for 42 years a practicing Christian. And I took it seriously. I spent 8 years of my life training as a theologian. I've worked in parishes. I've done what there is to do. And it was only very slowly and reluctantly that I gave it all up and realized that I did not believe it, and indeed never have. But I have tried to give it a good run, and I want to continue to do that. It seems to me very important not to misrepresent a religious tradition when one is criticizing it. And these are powerful suggestions. However, I don't in the end find them convincing. Here's one reason. Concerning analogy, we do use analogies often. We often understand other people. We often understand, indeed, the members of other species by analogy with our own, and so on. And there's no doubt that analogy can sometimes bridge the gap of cognitive asymmetry and distance. However, analogies have to be controlled by something, because otherwise they float free. And it may be very difficult to tell what belongs properly to the analogy and what does not. At some point, one has to have some body of literal truths with which to control the analogy. And that simply brings us back to my problem, because I don't think those truths are available for the reason I gave. That is, I think this element of the defense is finally circular. It presupposes a solution to my problem rather than solving it. A similar reply, I think, is to be made with regard to the matter of incarnation. Now, it's, I think, a pretty immediate implication of my view that there never has been an incarnation, though there are plenty that have been alleged, not just the Christian one. And here again, the difficulty is, as it were, the pluralism of the matter, which can only be controlled if we have some independent access to the truth. And that is precisely what it seems to me we do not have. Now this fades off into another problem that will be well known to many of you, and we may wish to pursue it further in discussion or not, as the case may be. And that is the whole issue of religious pluralism and its challenges. Regarding causes and their effects, I'm not so sure quite what to say about this. It's certainly true that for a long time all the theistic traditions, by the way, are in agreement about this, to take the physical world as effects of a non-physical supernatural cause, which can thus be known through its effects. Well, once again, though, I'm inclined to think that the problem is which ones. There are, after all, an awful lot of effects out there. Some of which, for example, are wholly undeserved and irremediable suffering. I don't think the theistic tradition will be advanced by supposing that this is a vital clue to the nature of the divine cause. This, of course, brings us back to one of the more traditional objections to theistic belief, the problem of evil, which I do indeed think is perhaps the single most grave difficulty for theists. There are a vast array of very mysterious effects evident in the physical world around us. Our own understanding of these things, of course, is so far relatively immature, though we're advancing rapidly. One of the problems for a person like Aristotle was that he had no good physical theory. He didn't know what matter was. He couldn't do any chemistry. He didn't have an adequate mathematics and couldn't do any physics. They wrote a book, commonly called Physics. It's no great shakes. What he was actually pretty good at was naked eye observation and biology based upon that. And he would be, I think, delighted with the advances of natural science in the modern period. We've gone way, way further because we've got better tools. At the same time, there is a great deal we do not know, and a great deal which we may very well never know about the physical world. Part of the problem in contact, for example, is not just that they are faced with a technology they don't understand, but a technology based upon physical principles which are not available to them, which they do not know. Some force is being applied in the transportation system that is unknown to the humans. This is why the Kenyan physicist said, could our physics really be that wrong? By the way, no changes are made to the system in the novel. That's a pure invention of the filmmakers. And though a number of people do die, it's due to an act of terrorism, not changes in the whole system. So, here again, it seems to me we have a kind of selection problem. It affects both the appeal to analogy, it affects the appeal to revelation, and it affects the appeal to knowing causes through their effects. Namely, you have to have some other way of deciding which effects are relevant, which analogical implications are relevant, which among many possible or alleged revelations, including alleged incarnations, is the correct one. Without that ability, I don't think these devices will help solve the problem. Rather, they presuppose a solution or they push the problem off to one further stage. But perhaps now we should entertain questions or other comments.
Let's do.
How do choices show more about a person's character than actions?
You know, that remark of his has puzzled me for a long time. And I'm not sure if I understand him. Especially because, after all, I think we would probably suppose that a choice is an action of a certain kind. But I suspect what he has in mind, I mean, knowing some of the rest of what Aristotle has to say there, that he's particularly interested in choice because it reveals deliberation. That is, it reveals on his analysis of it a certain kind of thinking, particularly means-ends relationships, practical thinking. Because his view is that a choice is the result always of a deliberation. Now, I have quarrels with this idea as well. But I think that's why he thinks that choices reveal more about an individual's fundamental values and purposes and intentions than just any old action whatsoever.
So a choice would be like a planned action, like if I plan on something I'm going to do and do that.
It's deliberate because deliberated.
All right.
That's, I think, a somewhat plausible view, that when you see the result of a person thinking a problem through, especially with regard to means and ends, you'll learn a great deal more about them than you would simply by observing what they do. But I'm afraid that's the best I can do.
That worked, that put it in way better perspective. Thank you.
I'm going to back up to your initial conversation about omniscience. Right?
Yeah.
And I think what I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that divine omniscience would suggest that God knows beyond an infinite number of propositional truth claims. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. And I guess I'm having a problem with propositional truth. Is that the only kind of truth that pertains to omniscience?
I do not know. Let me portray my what's the antonym for omniscience? Perfect ignorance of some kind. I do not know. I do think that propositional truth isn't the only kind of truth, even that you and I have available to us. I'm sticking with propositions because I have sort of a handle on that. We could represent them, for example, symbolically, and we could talk about logical relationships among them and so on. I take it according to the traditional view of omniscience, God knows, for example, all the truths of arithmetic, which are at least uncountably many. Way more than infinite, because he knows everything about all the numbers that there are, for example. He knows every truth about every conceivable geometrical object, on a flat surface, a curved surface, a hypersurface, any surface you care to mention, and so on and so forth. Now, the point I want to make here is that possession of, again, beyond infinite a cognitive set makes possible intentions and projects which I cannot grasp. And one of the points of the analogies I was trying to suggest is just this. As a child, there was no way I was going to understand what my parents were up to. I have a far better understanding now, what they were up to. I had no understanding what the neighborhood sex gang was up to.
Sure. But see, I mean, I guess
But
You do know that you are known by your parents.
Well, yes,
And
I
you
mean,
know that you
oh,
are
yeah,
loved by your
yeah,
parents.
I knew a lot about them, but here's the point I want to make. When it comes to the most fundamental projects that an agent takes on, the ones that are, how should we say, most heavily invested in, the ones that they care about the most, those are the very ones which are invisible in these analogical relationships. And it seems to me that this is what affiliation is mainly about. When we are affiliated with one another, we know each other and we know something fundamental about our purposes, intentions, and underlying values. And the more deeply we know one another, again, think about your most durable and valuable friendships. Think about spousal relationships. Think about mentoring relationships, so on. Where they are most successful, we know something fundamental about that other person. Then my point here is I think a divine being has fundamental projects which are not just vastly beyond our ability to conceive, but entirely beyond our ability to conceive. And that's not a basis for affiliation. Or indeed, it seems to me, intelligible communication or education.
So are you pleased with your conclusion?
Sorry?
Are you pleased with your conclusion?
No, I'm not very disturbed by my conclusion. Enough so that I would like to work it out better, at least, or see if there's any way to escape it.
I just was saying that because I was listening to you as you were talking about your childhood experiences, and you were talking about how you didn't understand because you had not experienced those things.
Yeah.
And so if you were to experience a relationship with Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit, that would change your argument completely.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I've been through what at least was alleged by everybody I knew to be just such an experience.
But you said you hadn't experienced it yourself.
No, I had experienced that myself.
You said that it was all, you said that you'd gone back to, that you really hadn't ever, what'd you say? You said you hadn't gone back to.
I said the conclusion I reached was that I...
Years of experience, but you
No.
back
It
on
wasn't
and
about
say-
experience. I've had religious experiences up the yin-yang. I've had all kinds of religious experiences. I've had religious hallucinations. I've had religious visions. You name one, I've had it. And as far as I can tell, had it genuinely, at least from a phenomenological point of view.
Did you have a near-death experience?
No, I haven't had a near-death
I'm
experience.
naming it though.
And I hope, frankly, never to have one
Well, and
until I'm actually near.
I say that because,
Though, I have to say, I damn near died in September.
but a near-death experience is actually, in the scientific realm, is that part where you're actually dead, you're registered dead, and you go and you connect with something on the other end, and then you come back and you have memory of it, like Dr. Eben Alexander, the neurosurgeon.
I don't believe that view at all. I don't think that's a scientific view at all. But let me get back to Sharon's question. No, what I concluded was that I hadn't believed it, not that I hadn't experienced it. It's quite possible
There's a
to,
negative problem.
it's quite possible to experience things that one doesn't believe. Charlie?
So I really like the way that you take this on using the concepts of epistemic distance and cognitive symmetry. I think it's a nice way to do that. I wonder though if you say that God's omniscient, the very fact that God's omniscient might be a way to overcome these problems of epistemic distance and cognitive symmetry. Right? Because so think back to your analogy with Anscombe, right? So Anscombe was wickedly smart, right? You were the undergraduate, right? You're aspiring to this level of philosophical ability, right? But nonetheless, Anscombe is still capable of explaining some of these to you.
Yes.
So it might be that cognitive asymmetry is problematic, but only relative to certain kinds of projects, right? And so with the project for you being the great sort of Anscombe level philosopher, it may be that cognitive asymmetry is problematic. But for understanding particular aspects of the capacity of Plato, it may be that the cognitive asymmetry wasn't at all problematic.
Yes.
So it might be that for some of our own personal projects, the cognitive asymmetry between us and God is going to be problematic. But for other dimensions of our own projects, it might be that God's omniscience allows God to have a way of communicating whatever relevant proposition to us to overcome the sort of problematic dimension of that.
I see what you're suggesting. It's a very, I think, very plausible suggestion. Let's see if I understand you.
Yeah, sorry, if I didn't convince you.
One measure of Anscombe's greatness as a philosopher is she could teach something useful to a person like me.
Well, I didn't quite say that, but I'll go along with it.
So we might argue that an omniscient being, especially one that is also omnipotent, possessed of every causal power appropriate for it to possess, and is also omnibenevolent, would also be a perfect teacher, and thus able to communicate across any cognitive distance. That seems to me perhaps a workable strategy. Then, there are other problems. But that might be a way to do it. The difficulty, again, will be cognitive distance, epistemic distance raised to a certain degree looks to be insurmountable.
Right.
Now, I mean, I can say the form of words, an omniscient being ought nonetheless be able to surmount the barrier and so on and so forth, ought to be able to teach the alphabet to the ants and so on. But I don't find it finally very compelling. Because the more I look at the question of epistemic distance, the more it looks like a really serious barrier, even on these very low levels of these childish analogies that I'm suggesting. And that once you raise it to not just a question of infinite distance, but greater than that, even, that's why it seems to me we're looking at something which is finally insurmountable. Even from the direction of the divine agent, supposing it was a divine agent. It's a theorem in information systems that the perfectly encoded message or signal is indistinguishable from noise. And this is an issue that's taken up in the course of Contact. Again, it doesn't appear in the film. Please read the novel. It's terrific. It's a really terrific read. It's an exciting novel. It's got really interesting characters. It's Sagan at his best. But they continually talk about, well, what would it be like for us to encounter an alien species that was not just, vastly more knowledgeable than ourselves, not just, say, 1 million years ahead in their physics, but even more than that. Because after all, it's at least possible that there are higher intelligence life forms out in the universe that are not just 1,000 years ahead of us, or 1 million years ahead of us, but 1 billion years ahead of us. Who may, I like David's image, of course it's a famous one, whose technology would be so strange to us as to appear equivalent to magic. And yet, omniscience is not merely infinitely greater than that, but more than infinitely greater than that. So, the distance is looking daunting. But I acknowledge that your strategy is a very plausible one.
Is the movie Contact the one with Jodie Foster?
Yes.
Oh, I love that movie.
Good choice.
Well, the reason I really love the movie is because all of the presuppositions of all these scientists who had all these things in place, even to the point of changing up the movie and saying that she can't go without a seatbelt. She's going to kill herself. We have to put a seatbelt on.
Yeah.
And so she gets in there and realizes the seatbelt's killing me. I got to get rid of the seatbelt. As soon as she got rid of the seatbelt, she's sitting there and she's free and she makes it.
Yeah.
Well, in her own experience at least, she makes it.
Yeah.
But to all outward appearances, the space thing went down into the water and broke, and she never had any experience at all. You said she was knocked out, I believe, right? And that she didn't have.
No, it's a little more.
Well, but then then she had recorded everything, so the tape kind of.
The tape is blank.
Even though it was blank, it
Full of
still
static.
showed
Yeah,
that
the
there
period of
was
static is exactly the right period of time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, even though we couldn't see her experience, and she experienced it, because of the very real information that the aliens had given to her from the other alien, she had an experience that meant something to her from her father walking on the beach there. And this is years ago, so I can't remember exactly what happened, but I remember I was impressed with how the technology was supposed to work, but everybody, all the scientists who knew stuff, said it ain't going to work because we have to have this other thing in place. Well, it turned out the technology was really good because it was from that other source. And then she goes and has an experience that is so existential, and then she goes to explain it to all of them, and they're like, it didn't take place because, look, it didn't even turn up on the thing, and you just fell into the ocean. You didn't work out. And
has scooped it. Indeed, it's one of the very important features in the novel that there were 5 of them who made the journey. Because they talk to each other not only during it, but afterwards. And they say to each other, for example, we're going to be separated now because there's this whole conspiracy thing that's going on. They're going to try to deny that this ever happened, but we know that it happened. So it's very important for each of us to make an independent record of exactly what we took the experience, and keep a record of that and compare them and communicate with each other as much as possible about what it was that happened and try to understand what happened. So it's no longer just one person's testimony. And it's no longer just one person's subjective testimony. There's evidence, for example, that the vessel that they're in has been subjected to tremendous gravitational effects because it's changed it, the strain has changed the metallic structure of the vessel, and so on. So I think that's an important element. Sagan sees this problem coming, and he's built things into the actual plot of Contact that the film doesn't copy. So the film is able actually to make a whole big issue about, shall we believe her or not? That doesn't arise in the case of the novel. Now, again, though, my point will be that it's an impressive set of events that are described. But back to Charlie's point, the aliens do indeed communicate successfully to the humans. We're talking about sending this vast set of instructions for how to build this machine, how to operate the machine. They, in the process, actually teach us a whole bunch of other technologies we've never had before. There are elements of the technology that still escape us. We don't end up understanding them. But we can build the device and make it work, which is what their intention was. At the same time, in the course of their conversations on the beach, and of course it's not her father, it's just an image.
Right, but
She doesn't experience her father.
Well,
She experiences an alien who looks like her father. And indeed, all the other members of the relationship.
And I think even though the one imagines it's the alien, I think it's actually her experience, and she comes back with, I mean, it may have been, at first I thought it was an alien, but it turned out that it was, he told her something no one could have ever known.
Well, it wasn't her father.
Well, it's been a long
Again,
time, like I said.
that's very, very, very clear in the novel. And indeed, each of the 5 meets the single most emotionally important person of their past life. But they are told, no, this is not the real person. It's a simulacrum of that person. That's made very clear. But again, I guess I'm belaboring the obvious point here, is that even here we have to do with an analogical situation, which is not just vastly different than the theistic problem, but more than infinitely different. And even so, these aliens have projects underway which they make no attempt to communicate to the humans. Because they know perfectly well the humans wouldn't get it and wouldn't understand what they were talking about. Rick?
Thank you for your stimulating rejoinder. I'm more interested in the structure of your argument. Just for clarification purposes,
Yeah.
as I understand it, the problem of epistemic distance poses a threat to securing friendship with God.
Yeah.
That's a conclusion, or that's a way to summarize what you were trying to defend. My question, and then I'll follow it up with another question, is whether this conclusion or thesis depends on a specific interpretation, or depends on perfect being theology interpreted certainly.
Yes.
It does. Okay. So then, if we poke holes or find problems with perfect being theology.
No, you should see it coming, Rick. You can construct a modus tollens.
Exactly. I was thinking of
If
a modus tollens.
If perfect being theology is true, then further down the line you come to my conclusion.
Then, exactly.
Turn it around, since my conclusion is false,
Yes.
right? Reject perfect being theology.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
exactly.
actually, I think, the most effective reply.
Okay, so I was thinking maybe turn his modus ponens into modus tollens. Every man.
One man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens.
So I was just I was just wondering, maybe there's a problem with perfect being theology.
Yeah,
I
maybe there
sketched
is.
out.
Yeah, I wish Tim Clancy was here, because he'd be all over this.
Okay.
He despises perfect being theology.
Okay, good, all right.
And he would start by saying, well, first of all, God isn't an entity, and off we go. Now, there's a longer conversation to be made there. There have been, of course, alternatives to perfect being theology. I'm not myself satisfied, mainly on historical grounds, that the alternatives are any better. I mean, it just seems to me that perfect being theology captures very, very well the mainstream of historical classical theism.
Classical theism in the West.
Well, I mean, all three theistic traditions.
Okay.
Now, again, this is a further argument, and of course, it's at best an inductive conclusion.
Yeah.
At this point, we're talking about an argument to best explanation. That does seem to me to be the best explanation. If one rejects it, of course, my argument falls to the ground, because that is one of my premises.
Right, exactly. So I was thinking about it in terms of anatomy. So one of my worries with the perfect being theology would be this claim that, okay, God is all-knowing, right? Or the attribute knowledge is almost univocally attributed to God. I have a problem with that when we say he's all-knowing, omniscient. I think some Christians might not want to do that, so that we might have an inkling of what that means, but really, at the same time, we may have a reservation about saying that he's all-knowing in the same sense that we always use that word knowledge in other philosophical contexts. There's that kind of hesitancy to apply it directly to God.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I'm going to try to keep knowledge as clear as I can. And I think finally I would resort to a formal epistemic logic to do it, which is also, I think, the one possible court of appeal to try to actually get a sharp notion of epistemic distance. But my knowledge of epistemic logics is pretty thin. But sure, I mean, you could pick any of the leading conceptual components here and say, well, if we reject that way of thinking about it, then the argument falls to the ground. Yes, that's perfectly true. If perfect being theology is not the best way to explicate classical theism, the argument falls to the ground. If knowledge applied in this setting has to have some other special meaning, the argument falls to the ground. Agreed. I'll stand by my premises because I don't think I have any better ones. But those are, of course, separate issues that involve separate arguments. And we're unlikely to reach agreement about all of them.
Thank you.
I have so many questions, and I hope that I ask this in an organized fashion, but I was just wondering, we put our ideas out there, and being, as smart as we can as intelligent beings and rational animals, we are putting God in a framework that is a human framework, and we're thinking parent-child, human ants, species, all these things. But in understanding God as a perfect being a perfect God, we have no idea what that is, except to create something from analogy like a parent or another species. And what I'm wondering is two things. I'm wondering if in imposing that paradigm on God, and God smiling gently and moving beyond our own paradigm, maybe there's a larger field that we're missing because we're not God, and perhaps there's something else that still keeps God in the perfect being area, but we're not understanding it in the same way. For example, even if we were to take the relationship of a parent and child, and the child has no idea what's going on when her parent's reading her Shakespeare when she's 3 months old, the parent is still loving the child enough to maybe get cadences going and that kind of thing. But that's such a human and limping analogy to something as glorious as an infinitely perfect being, if so,
Well, yeah.
I'm looking at a creature that is loved, and so loved that, according to Revelation, and bringing that aspect into it, every person, all of creation is redeemed through this act of redemption. And now I just skipped out of that one paradigm, and I'm into my other question now. But first of all, you were gonna say something, and I'll just let you say it, and then.
Well, I'm not sure what your question is.
Well, my question
About
is,
these frameworks.
we're just, I think when we're saying perfect being theology, or is that what it is, perfect being theology, is that what it is? Is that something that, I mean, do we have to put that in a box, or do we understand what a perfect God is?
Well, I mean,
To
we're talking,
understand how
we're talking here certainly about human conceptions of these things, but that's the only conceptions we have. We don't have any others. We're human beings. We have human conceptions.
So if we're thinking that God couldn't possibly be totally connected to us, is that what the?
Well, that's my
conclusion is?
hypothesis.
Right, but why are we saying God couldn't be connected to us when it's our perception of distance, when in reality, as God, it can do everything? He might even be able to hunker down in front of us like another child and say, hi, I saw you were having trouble today with that bully. I mean, why are we putting him in a box?
Well, because you have to put him in a box. If you're trying to understand it.
Well, I know, and we're limiting him.
You're putting him in a box
anyway,
too. It's
but-
just one box or the other.
Yeah.
You don't have any choice about this. You only have human conceptions to use.
Mhm.
There are no other conceptions available to us. Now, occasionally, we develop new ones. And this is often, I mean, this is indeed one of the functions of philosophy, as well as all of the other humanistic arts and sciences, to give us new concepts.
And I have another
And
concept.
so, the
with
box is not fixed, and the box is not static, but you don't have anything else to appeal to. So again, I think it's part of a larger argument. I've looked at every major theological metaphysics that I can find, and I come back to perfect being theology as the most satisfying, mostly from a historical point of view. As I look especially at the development of Christian doctrine, because that's the tradition I know best, in particular. Now, it may not be. It may be wildly wrong. It may be wildly wrong. Human beings, after all, are demonstrably not very good at metaphysics. We're pretty good at physics, at least so far, but physics is child's play compared to metaphysics. And we're still struggling with most of the same metaphysical problems that Plato did. We have some better ideas about where the dead ends are. I mean, I really do think substance dualism, all due respect to others who may have a different view, is a dead end, and I think we know that. But that's, you know, that's not a lot of progress for 25 centuries in discussion. I sort of hope, I mean, I'm a big fan of Carl Sagan. I'm a big fan of the SETI project. I'm delighted by the fact that we now have good evidence suggesting that there's as many as 2.2 habitable planets per stellar system in our own galaxy. It solves a fundamental gap in the Drake equation. I sincerely hope that there are vastly more intelligent higher life forms out there. I hope that some of them are good at metaphysics. Because we're not very good at it. So, it seems to me entirely in the cards that there is a better metaphysical framework in which to cast our problem. But it's not available to me. If somebody will make it available to me, I'll be the first person to take notes and see if my problem still arises. Yeah?
What was the deeper evil that started your concern? Like, where did it begin? Like me, I think animals have nerve endings, so I think it was like a retarded child. So I think if we heard a retarded child, and it's like, but we have the right to eat animals, then I get into circles. Like, where's morality? Like, whose side do I choose? Like, I want to eat meat, but that makes me happy. But then if I eat the meat, then that kills something, so that makes me sad. So, like you said, if you trace it back far enough, you're going to find that I talk in circles.
Okay, so do I.
With the religious aspect, you said if you trace it far enough, the evil is the problem with the good, right? You said evil is the fault of the religion.
No, I was just simply, at one point, I think, in the discussion, it seemed to me we were, as it were, lurching off in the direction of the traditional problem of evil, which is, in my view, especially what's called the evidential problem, the most serious objection to classical theism. But again, that's really a subject for a whole other discussion, one we've actually had here in the Socratic more than once. And it is a persistent problem, but that's what I have in mind. And that basically is the view that the distribution of unmerited and unredemptive suffering is such as to make the truth of classical theism improbable.
So you're saying because there is suffering, then nothing can be perfect.
Well, not just because there's suffering, but because there's undeserved and pointless suffering. A vast array.
So because bad things happen.
The vast array of living things have lived and died in misery, including human beings. We here in this room are enormously fortunate for that not to be the case. And we are rara avis indeed.
So I just want to make sure, I'm just trying to go with where you're going there real quick. So what you're saying is that how can there be a perfect relationship with somebody that believes perfectly but has its beings live in suffering?
It's not clear to me that it's possible to have a friendship, to summarize the notion of affiliation, with a being that it is a perfect knower. And for the reasons I've given. Or at least that's what I've attempted to do, is give those reasons. Yeah, Brian.
I just point of clarification. What was your definition of infinite at the beginning of your talk?
Countably many.
Pardon me?
Countably many.
Okay. And so an infinite distance, that when you use infinite there, does it have the same meaning? Or
Yeah, we could use it the same meaning, but what I'm trying to get a grip on is a distance that is larger than that.
okay, so something that's beyond infinite would
Vastly
mean,
beyond.
would mean
Well, I think that increases the barrier, strengthens the barrier. That would be an uncountable set. Can't be put into a one-to-one relationship with the natural numbers.
okay. So when, for example, when classical theists, Thomas, for example, talks about God being infinite, he's not thinking in terms of an infinite set.
No,
He didn't have
probably
set.
not, because, well, first of all, he doesn't have any set theory to use, and he doesn't have any transfinite arithmetic to use. So he's not going to be able to set the notion of infinity in a class of relationships, of which it is only just one.
Right.
Now, he doesn't have that conceptual framework. That doesn't really arrive until late in the 19th century and the early 20th century, both in mathematics and in physics.
So when a classical theist, Thomas again, for example, talks about God being infinite in some way, he's not talking in terms of infinite
No,
sets.
no.
So what's that conception of infinity?
I don't know.
Would that change in any way the problem?
Probably, yeah. But maybe why it didn't bother him so much. Or if it did, it bothered him only at the end. If my wild speculation about the end has anything going for it. Everybody wants to claim that Thomas was on their side. So they have a blinding illumination. And I'm not immune to that.
I find it a little odd that you would have a supposition of beings with increasingly greater intelligence, where the only evidence that we have, is either by very few eyewitness accounts or mere conjecture, versus the incarnation that has had limited eyewitness accounts, but yet has become a central part of Western history.
There's no end of credibility in human beings. We've accepted wild delusions, hallucinations, and outright contradictions for thousands of years.
Absolutely. I'm just saying from a common sense point, from my point of view, it just seems odd that you would have a belief in beings.
No. I didn't say I believed it. I don't believe that there are any higher intelligence life forms out there. I hope that there are such.
Okay.
I do believe that it is possible, because after all, there are some in this room.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there may be other rooms elsewhere. No, that's merely my hope, not my belief. I don't know that there are any such. I merely hope that there are. I hope also that we eventually communicate with one another, but I can understand their reluctance to communicate with us. Sagan entertains what's called the zoo hypothesis in Contact. This doesn't appear in the film either. Let me tell you, the novel is just way better. It's just way better, and it's conceptually richer, and the characters are really interesting. The character of Vagin, for example, the Russian physicist who's part of this team, he's a kick. The zoo hypothesis says that the aliens are out there communicating madly with one another, but not to us, because they know what we are. We are the most cooperative species on the planet. We are also among the most aggressive. And you might want to isolate a very aggressive, highly intelligent, technological species for a while and see what develops. But I think on that point, I've just about run out of energy. So thank you very much for your kind attention and your